Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. My name's Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And let me switch this thing over to the proper view here so that we don't look like the Brady Bunch. And so anyway, I'm going to go, the format of this is we typically go through the news of the week, and then we'll do the events that are happening, and then we'll go into a deep dive on a topic. This week's topic is going to be about making the final connection for your solar array to the grid. So let's go ahead and jump into the news of the week. A new report from the American Council on Renewable Energy found what pretty much all of us would assume to be the obvious, that when you place a tariff on solar panels and solar cells, that the cost of those solar cells and panels will go up. What they did find is that the impact of the recently enacted 50% tariff on imported panels that are coming in from China and 4 other Southeastern Asian nations, will possibly increase the price of modules here in the US 10 to 15 cents a watt. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's nearly doubling the price of solar panels over the next couple of years. Now, in May, the Biden administration announced a 50% tariff that would go into effect on solar panels imported from China, as well as Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. In 2023, 88% of all of the solar panels installed in the US were actually imported. And of those imported panels, 84% of them came from those 4 nations. So it's significant there. Despite a huge investment in domestic manufacturing that was made through incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, actually in 2023, imports of solar panels increased 40% over 2022. So we're still very heavily reliant on imported panels. Toledo Solar has announced this week that they'd be shutting down their Ohio operations. And this company manufactures thin film cadmium telluride solar panels, and their nearby competitor, First Solar, is actually the largest U.S. solar manufacturer of cadmium telluride panels and of any kind of panel in the U.S. And they actually invented that technology. Now they market to utility scale systems, and Toledo Solar was hoping, or had made announcements, that they were going to take this technology, try and introduce it into the commercial and the residential marketplace. Well, their recent troubles came about when they were awarded the contract to replace the solar panels that had been placed on the Ohio governor's mansion. Now, in 2004, GEO, Green Energy Ohio, which is the Ohio chapter of ACES, which is the American Solar Energy Society, they had installed a small solar array on the carriage house at the governor's mansion. That's pictured right there. First, solar panels were used largely because they were made in Ohio. It all makes sense politically. Then in 2022, they decided to replace these panels, so they awarded the contract to Toledo Solar. Well, First Solar was asked to come and remove the old solar panels and recycle them. The technician from First Solar got there. He looked at the new installation and noticed that the panels were actually First Solar panels, that Toledo Solar had altered the labels to make them look as if they had been manufactured by Toledo Solar. So then the lawsuits began. Well, what ended up happening is the management of Toledo Solar were replaced, but they've never recovered from this. And now they're shutting down operations. Michigan is the 29th state to enact legislation that prevents homeowners associations, or HOAs, from prohibiting the installation of solar within their jurisdiction. Now, it may not sound like a big deal, but 1.4 million Michiganders, I love that term, live within HOAs, and nationwide, over 75 million people live within jurisdictions that are covered by HOAs. Many cases, HOAs have been very hostile to the installation of solar, coming all the way down to outright banning it within their subdivisions. So now this legislation joins 29 other states, and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer is expected to sign it into law this week. The FBI recently announced they warned private solar installers that as we began to see an expansion of renewable energy systems, we will also see the expansion of cyber criminals hacking into these systems. While it's still very rare in residential systems to get a cyber attack, it's getting increasingly common when you talk about larger microgrids and utility scale systems. The FBI basically says your prevention is to just practice what they refer to as good basic cyber hygiene, which is essentially don't reuse passwords. Try and keep all of the various systems isolated from each other with firewalls. Keep your software up to date. Those usually have security patches built into them. Back up your data and monitor your systems. That'll go a long way towards preventing some of this cyber criminal activity. And new projections by Wood Mackenzie estimate that global solar and wind will actually triple over the next 10 years, growing to more than 8 terawatts of generating capacity. China is going to account for the lion's share of this new growth, installing 3.5 terawatts within that nation alone. And energy storage systems are also going to see a huge spike in installations, growing, and I found this number very specific, 636% over the next decade. So let's hope they're not off by a percent or two. So what do you do with an abandoned nuclear power plant? Well, apparently converted over to solar. The Department of Energy has entered into a couple of agreements with some developers, specifically in Idaho. There's an old nuclear facility there that was shut down. They're putting in now a 400 megawatt solar array within that facility. DOE is also negotiating with developers for similar plants in Nevada. The DOE spokesperson said that data centers are very likely to be the main purchasers of the generation coming from there, and actually speculated that they might co-locate these data centers or cryptocurrency facilities at these nuclear power plant facilities. And that is the news from the solar industry for the last 2 weeks. Does anybody have anything they wanted to add into that mix? Anything that crossed your desk at all? Give you just a second on that. All right. You can always jump in as I say, as we go through. The next thing here we'll do is just announcements of events that are coming up, webinars. Most all of these, or most of them, are free. Today, July 16th at 2 p.m., there's a webinar on agrivoltaic development. Then there's also tomorrow, 1 p.m., July 17th, Soluna Storage Systems. This is offered through Renvu. Some of their webinars are quite good. So I'm not going to give you the links on any of these. Now that you're aware of them, you can find them on the web.
I was wondering why you wasn't watching him. He's watching everybody. Oh.
Yeah. All right. So July 18th through the 19th, RE Plus Mid-Atlantic in Philadelphia. That's a face-to-face conference will be taking place. On July 23rd at 2 p.m., Fronius is going to be announcing their next generation inverter. I'm actually signed up. I'm going to attend that one because I want to see what they're doing. They're one of the big players in the residential market for inverters. There's one, this could probably be for anybody, healthcare benefits within your business, but it's focused on solar. On July 25th at 2 p.m. August 8th, 2 p.m., selling whole home energy proposals. This one's coming in from Aurora Solar. That's being offered. And then I thought I would throw this one out here just to make you aware of it. This isn't a webinar, but it's a document that's available, a white paper about mastering the art of trust-based selling. I occasionally get people who are in the business trying to sell solar, and maybe this is going to have some good pointers there. And then, of course, our shameless advertisement about our online courses as well as face-to-face courses at solarpvtraining.com. and we are still projecting getting the update of our entry-level textbook, Understanding Photovoltaics. I had hoped to have that out by now, but the publishers are going back and forth with some technical things. So it's all there ready, but we'll wait. So I'll let you know when it's available. I'm sure everybody will not be able to sleep now. So okay, so any other announcements, anything else you want to add into the mix here before I jump into our deep dive? Oh, it says Jay has taken over my screen share.
Did I do something?
I don't know. Okay. Somebody said you took over screen share. I just turned it off. So, okay.
Didn't mean to.
Okay. Good enough. All right. Hopefully, okay. So let me get into our deep dive here on connecting your solar array to the grid. And the reason I thought I would bring this up is I've been getting a number of people who have had very specific questions about that final connection here. So I just thought this might make a good topic for discussion here. And as per normal, if you guys have any questions, one of the advantages of this format is we do have live interaction with various folks. So if you've got a perspective or you think I said something wrong or just want to add in a comment, just feel free to jump in. So what am I talking about when we're making the final connection to the grid? And for those people who install systems, this is just, kind of you've done it so many times, it's intuitive. But for folks who don't do that, there may be confusion or misunderstanding about just how are these units connected in so that you're feeding to the grid. And the most common one is going to be, well, first we should differentiate between load side connection and a supply side or a line side connection. So for smaller residential systems, I think it's fair to say that most installers would love to do a load side connection. The load side connection is simply a you go into the circuit breaker box and you connect into a double pole breaker. And so this is a diagram here of what they look like. You would go from your panels to a combiner box to the disconnect to an inverter, this string inverter to your AC disconnect, which is located out by your meter. And then you're going to connect into a double pole breaker within your service panel or your circuit breaker box, what most people would refer to there. All right. So so when you are making a connection into your service panel, there's a thing referred to as the 120% rule. So what the issue is pretty much is on your circuit breaker, you're going to get service coming in from the utility. The utility in most homes going to be 200 amp service today. Some older homes are going to have only 100 amp service. Really old homes, way back, 40s, 50s, they were getting 60 amp service coming in. And before that, the 20s and 30s, homes were receiving 10, 15 amps from the utility. But today, typically you're building a new home, it's going to be 200 amp service coming into your system. So if we have a 200 amp breaker, main breaker there at the top, and in this diagram, that's what we're talking about here, is jumping in your main disconnect will be rated for 200 amps. That's going to throttle down the amount of service that's coming from the utility. So no more than 200 amps will be allowed into your home. And the way that works, of course, is as you turn on loads, it's almost like sucking power out of the utility. The more loads you turn on, the more amperage is going to be drawn through that. But you cannot exceed 200. If you do, that main breaker is going to trip. Very rare for that to happen. I don't know. I've never experienced it, and very few people that I know have experienced their main breaker tripping. You usually experience the breaker in your kitchen tripping when you turn on the microwave and the coffee maker and the whatever, the skillet, the hot plate, and all of a sudden you've exceeded the 20 amp or 25 amp service there, and that breaker pops. But your main breaker, very rare. The bus bar rating, that metal bit that connects all of those breakers together, it has an amperage rating as well. In this case, I'm just giving you the example of 200 amps. So let's say that that's rated to carry no more than 200 amps, just like wires are rated to carry 200 amps. So if I show you that, you would think, okay, this service panel is rated at 200 amps. The breaker is rated at 200 amps. We're maxed out. No more power can come in. Well, the NEC has acknowledged that very few people use that full 200 amps, that's being available to you. And that if you do want to put in a breaker from your from your solar array, you can go up to 120% of the bus bar rating. So what that says specifically in the code 705.12 is that where there are two sources, so we're not just talking about solar, it could be a generator, could be something else, one primary source, the other an additional power source, are located at the opposite ends of the bus bar that contains loads the sum of 125% of the power sources, and so on. Now they get into NEC speak, but basically you can't exceed more than 120% of the ampacity rating of the bus bar. Okay, so why do they say opposite ends of the bus bar? Well, what we do here when we're installing our system is we say, all right, if you're going to put in a 40 amp breaker, which you could do on a 200 amp panel, you want to put it as far away from the main as possible. Well, why would you want to do that? It's because if you're drawing power from the loads and you're feeding from both ends of the bus bar, then that power, that ampacity is not going to double up. It's going to just go from the closest one and feed, the most available one feed, but it's not going to double up. If we put the breaker at the top of the bus bar, like I just illustrated in this here, then you could be drawing down that bus bar with both sources of energy, and you could, in theory, exceed the rating and perhaps even melt that bus bar. So that's why they want you to put it at opposite ends. All right. Is that portion of that, the 120% rule, pretty clear to folks? Anybody have a question on that before I jump on? Oh, I got a thumbs up. What do you know? All right. So, okay. So now that's the old way. And in fact, in a lot of the literature I was reading, preparing for this, they're saying, okay, this thing, that's cumbersome. That's very kludgy. It makes a lot of assumptions that don't often happen, that you've got the full 200 amps coming in, full 40 amps going there. And most systems now in the world of solar, especially if you've got a AC coupled system or a DC coupled system, they're going to have energy management systems built in. So what is an energy management system? Well, it's a system in this example that ensures that the energy is stored in the battery properly and then delivered in a way that is managed. All right. So there are some options there. Let me see where my, the code acknowledges this. So essentially what they're saying is it's no longer a passive system. It's no longer whatever power is needed is going to flow, and it's going to flow where it's going to go. It is now an actively managed system with some intelligence put in there. So if we begin to find ourselves in a situation where we're going to exceed the bus bar limitations, it can be programmed to throttle down one or more of those power sources to make sure that bus bar limitation is not exceeded. So the NEC has acknowledged this, and they've said, all right, let's put some language in there. When you have power control systems, let me zoom in on that a little bit. When we have a power control system, a PCS, that is controlling this, we're going to essentially allow for that and perhaps even exceed that 120% rule. That's the effective takeaway of what's happening here. So this came into effect in the 2020 code. It was refined somewhat in the 2023 code. So I thought I would mention which codes are applicable where in the US. So the NEC, the 2023 code, is applicable in the states here with dark blue. It's bus bar only phone. Okay. And then the 2023 code is in that sort of tealish color. 2020 code is in the dark blue, so, or dark, almost black. So any of those states where those colors initiate, this is allowed. Now, most states will let you go with a newer code as opposed to the older code, but you can see that not every state is dealing with the most recent NEC that's available. This year in Ohio, it was kind of interesting. They leapfrogged because we went from the 2017 code and jumped ahead to the 2023 code. So that was kind of interesting that we leapfrogged over that. So just this is almost a little bit of an aside, just to let you know which your things are, which ones are subject to that. Does anybody have a question on the controls? Wanda, let me, I think I muted you again. So can you jump in? I'm not getting you. Gonna ask you to unmute there.
Okay.
All right.
With the new codes and laws, would that cause homeowners to have to get new bus bars, new controllers on their house if they have an older home? I can understand for new homes that this control system and things could be built in and to affect the bus bars, but people with older homes, would they have to change?
No. In fact, what this does is by allowing for these controllers to be part of your system, it actually gives us flexibility when we add like additional power sources to the thing. My assumption is your older home, if there's a solar array there, you were conforming with the 120% rule for the bus bar. So you're fine. I'm just saying that under the 120% rule, if you have a 200 amp service with a 200 amp bus bar, you're limited to a 40 amp input from your inverter. But if you can put in some control systems, you might be able to upsize because now you can actively control that. And so the NEC is saying the 120% rule is no longer hard and fast. If there are controllers, we can deal with it. But the older stuff is not going to be a problem, you know, again, unless you add in a solar array or another generating source, at which point you're going to have to comply just like everybody else does. But this isn't a requirement that you have active management. It's just acknowledging a lot of these systems are now allowing for that. So let's let our systems be smarter. That's kind of what.
So these can be just plugged into your existing load center?
Yeah, there are several options there. Oftentimes, like a PV system, if you've got an AC coupled or a DC coupled system, there's usually going to be a battery management system of some sort built into the battery pack. You know, with these lithium ion batteries, they're no longer just a battery with a charge controller that might be external. Now you've got battery management systems that are built in, and a EMS or a energy load management system or a PCS or whatever they want to call it may be built into that begins to monitor some of the activity of your loads. You'll kind of, that'll hit home a little bit when you talk about for instance, like an N-phase system, when they're talking about wanting to be able to control the charging of your vehicle. And I'm going to look to see when your loads are drawing heavy and when they're drawing light. And we're going to moderate how we're going to be charging the EV based on that. That's going to be specifically important if you're a commercial entity that's subject to demand charges. which are based on the most energy you use over a 10 or a 15-minute period over the course of the month. Well, if you're already in a high demand period where you're using a lot of energy, you don't want to throw on EV charging on top of that, which could dramatically increase your electric bill that month. You want your system to be smart enough to say, all right, you know what, let's charge the battery of the vehicle when we're not using so much other power. So it has that capability. And more of these systems are building that kind of thing in. So
It doesn't know what kind of plan you have, though. You have to program that. Is that true?
yeah, you're going to have to plug them in. Some of them are going to be some of them are going to be complex, how you do the programming. Others are going to be, options, kind of am I on vacation mode? Do I want to deal with this for time of day pricing? Do I want to deal with this for demand charge management? How do I want to do that? And so the more sophisticated they get, the easier they're going to be to deal with. But we're still kind of in the floppy disk age of all of this. So it's going to be probably cumbersome, but we're moving in that direction. And it's not just in the battery. Yeah, Wanda, you had a question?
Yeah, do you have discussions, or do you have some information more on off-grid systems? I'm sitting in my greenhouse and I have one of those newer battery inverters sort of thing. They monitor the use of what I have. So I'm collecting in the day, but I have solar lights and things go on and off, and I don't have to worry about a lot. But I'm really not into making money for big companies, because I see them using solar, charging the public.
Whoop. I see you froze up. Yeah, no, I'm sympathetic with you. We do have a number of these videos that we've done on standalone systems. So I'd invite you just to go in and look on Solar Noon Tuesday on the solarpvtraining.com website or our YouTube channel. And there's a lot of stuff in there on that. But that's not what we're focused on right here. Okay, let me jump back into the management systems, because I think as we were talking about there, and Megan pointed out, the systems are active within some of these battery management systems, but then they're also you could buy a smart panel, where every single circuit on your service panel is managed. I've got a picture of it right up there. Or you can put in smart circuit breakers, which are also above there. So you don't have to actually manage every panel, but you can get those smart circuit breakers. And they were talking about like EMSs versus smart load panels, basically saying that most of your big loads, 75% of the loads really are consumed by only three to five major appliances, like your oven, swimming pool, HVAC, electric hot water heater, your EV charging. So you may not want to go ahead and invest in the full thing here. Let me back up and show you, like the whole big load center. That's going to require you swap out everything, but you can buy these new breakers that will manage the specific loads. And maybe that's something you want to do if you don't already have a load management system. So these are all options. We're really getting more and more into load management, both at the utility end and also at the individual customer end, where you begin to manage your loads in hopefully an intelligent manner. But there are going to be a lot of options, and it's going to make everybody confused until this all settles down. All right, let me ask you if you had a question before I jump in.
Hey, Jay, I was just going to comment that I think that all of these new load management systems, let's assume that they're properly configured and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's going to, for electrical installers, it creates a new service line where I think, people may have warranty or service agreements that fixes broken stuff. But I think there's going to be an ongoing optimization of some of these systems, and that, in fact, can be a new offer for solar installers. And, if they're looking for models of how this happens, look for almost any upgradable technology, whether it's from mobile phones or medical technology, whatever. I just think it's going to be a new opportunity for revenue sources for installers.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's funny. We just had event at Blue Rock Station. We do an annual party we call Goat Stock, where most of our old interns come back. And one of the interns who is there is doing solar, and his whole job is now going out and doing troubleshooting and repairs for systems, some of which they installed their company, but most of them are other companies. And he gets a lot into that maximization. You know, these things just simply are not performing up to my expectation. So, you know, we've talked about all the different, you know, various careers that are out there, like doing annual inspections of the systems, you know, checking torque, tweaking connections, testing batteries, doing lawn care, doing snow removal, cleaning the panels. Now you're bringing up another one of actually optimizing load management, another huge thing. One of the jokes we like to say is that anymore it takes you 2 days to install the system and it takes you 2 weeks to program it. So, you know, we're kind of moving into this whole world of a solar installer to a large extent is becoming a bit of a computer programmer as well. So that's a big deal. So, okay, so I'll jump out of the load management, but just realize that load management is increasingly going to be a part of your job. Not only in the initial install, but as was pointed out in some of the care and feeding of the customers and perhaps services that you can offer, especially as utilities get into time of use pricing. The utilities, as Wanda was pointing out, are, you know, large corporations that are trying to, I'll be very kind to them, they're trying to maximize their return on every customer, which is another nice way of saying they're trying to take every bit of your money. Since you have no choice. And so the more we can limit those, they're coming in with time of day pricing, they're coming in with load demand charges. We need to be able to counter attack that with technology. All right. Now, one of the questions that came to me this week, and this actually spurred some of this discussion that I wanted to look at, has to do with emergency disconnects. And I know a lot of installers out there don't realize that the code now requires that you have an emergency disconnect for 1 or 2 family dwellings at the meter. So what do we mean by an emergency disconnect? Well, this old meter box used to be just fine, right? And then from there, you would go on and you would connect into your main disconnect at the service panel. But anymore, this disconnect is what this meter is what you're going to need. And right below that meter box, you're going to have what looks like a very small service panel. Inside there's an emergency disconnect, just a double pole breaker. That's not going to be your main disconnect. That's going to be your main breaker. And then oftentimes there are 4 to who knows how many, 20, 30. You could have a whole sub panel underneath there, but another bunch more breakers available there. And while I'm on that subject, I should point out that those of you who do electrical work, this might not occur to you, but you know, in your main service panel, you're allowed to mix, you bond together the neutral and the grounds, the equipment grounds. So when you look at a service panel, if it's done properly, all of the white wires, all the neutral wires are going to be on one bus bar. All of the equipment ground wires, the bare copper or the green wires are going to be on another bus bar. And then they're going to be bonded together, either through the box with a green screw, or they're going to be a jumper between the two. Now, a lot of times I've seen where they're just intermixed. The ground and the neutrals are just mixed. It's effectively the same thing in your main breaker panel. But sub panels, you don't want to bond them together. You want to keep the neutral and the grounds separated. Well, now you've just made your main panel a sub panel by connecting this in. So let's say that you're in a jurisdiction and you've gone and put in a solar array, and the inspector says you're making a major change to the system. So now you have to upgrade to the most recent code. And one of the provisions of that code is you have to put in an emergency disconnect. Well, now you've made your main service panel a sub panel. So you're going to have to make sure you go in and basically unbond, separate the ground from the neutral. So that's just pointing it out. Could be additional work there. I think I had, here in the description of what does that mean. It's in 230.85 about emergency disconnects. And essentially they're just saying that these things have to be out there at the meter, and grouped with other disconnects, which we do that. I don't want to get into that in the solar world, but you put your AC disconnect for your array out there. You put your rapid shutdown disconnect for your battery bank. All of that's going to be out there.
Does that mean that you've effectively increased your maximum 200 amps with this little sub panel or whatever?
Well, I think what it means to me, and I do want to touch on, I'll answer yours in a roundabout way, but let's say you're doing a typical residential system and you see this little box out here now is outside the house, and it's got a couple of openings there for double pole breakers. Well, if I'm doing a N-phase system, for example, I can now come down the side of the building with my wires from the array, go to my AC disconnect and my combiner box. They can be mounted right outside there on the wall, and then pop straight into this double pole breaker. It's a load side connection. It's between the main, it's on the customer side of the main because the main is at the top of that box. And I never have to penetrate the wall. I don't have to swap out my service panel if my service panel is full, which happens a lot, where you've got to now hire an electrician and spend a couple $1,000s to upgrade your service panel. So I can jump in there. So I think that might be getting to what you're saying is if the service panel is inadequate, we're making the connection at another location. And so it may be that we're getting around that whole 120% rule there. And that sort of leads me into my next slide here, because that was the question somebody asked me during the week. If I do make a connection out there at the meter, do I have to adhere to the 120% rule in my main panel, but also in that emergency disconnect box? Are we subject to the same thing? Like I've got 200 amp service coming in from the utility. I've got all those breakers. I'm coming in with more power. Do I have to look at the bus bar rating on that emergency disconnect to make sure I haven't exceeded the 120% rule? Do I have to stick it as far away from the main as possible? All of those kind of things. And I wasn't able to find somebody specifically addressing this, but then hopefully my logic plays out here, where this is kind of a rough diagram of what we're talking about. On the left-hand side there, you've got the meter itself. The meter's been pulled. It acts like a fuse, so when you pull the meter, you're disconnecting there from the main or from the utility. But then you go down to that main breaker that's directly underneath of it. Now let's assume that that main breaker is 200 amps. So you've got 200 amp service from the utility. Now somewhere in those breakers down below, I've added in a 40 amp or maybe a 60 amp or maybe an 80 amp, solar array. What does that do? Well, all of the power coming from this system feeds out of the bottom of that bus bar and feeds to my main breaker. If I've got a 200 amp breaker in my service panel in the house, it doesn't matter if the power is coming from the utility or from my array. It's never going to draw more than 200 amps or that main breaker is going to pop. So I would think that by putting your array into this emergency disconnect, you've completely eliminated the issue of just how much power, the 120% rule or the bus bar ruling or any of that, because it's never going to exceed 200 amps going towards the house. And it's never going to exceed whatever the generation from the inverter is going to the grid. Let's say you have no load on the house, so 100% of what you're generating is going from the array to the grid. So if you've got a 200 amp service coming in, I'm assuming that utility disconnect has to be rated for at least 200 amps. Well, then to my mind, you can put anything up to a 200 amp inverter attached to that.
It
In
wouldn't
there.
make sense that 120% rule would now apply to your disconnect.
Yeah,
So
but I don't know why it would. I guess that's my logic. Is the idea is you could exceed 120, you could exceed the bus bar rating in a load center because you're drawing from
Right.
loads. But in this case, your only load is going to be the home, and that's limited to 200 amps, assuming you got a 200 amp breaker at your formerly main disconnect at the service panel. So no power is going to flow down that bus bar greater than whatever the breaker is at your load center within the house.
Are you still doing a load side solar connection now in the disconnect?
Yeah,
So wouldn't then you've got a bus bar in the disconnect. Now
right.
you would apply the 120% rule to the disconnect bus
Well,
bar.
let's say that I've got 200 amps there coming into the disconnect, and I've got 60 amps coming in from an array.
Yeah.
So in theory, I've got 260 amps feeding that bus bar, in theory, potentially. But the main disconnect in the house is 200 amps.
Yeah. I think I follow that, but maybe I'm barking on the wrong tree. I'm now saying don't worry about the bus bar that's inside of your your breaker panel. Now go to the left inside of your meter socket.
I know. Yeah. No, I understand your logic, and that's where I started with all of this. Is what's different? Well, what I'm saying is different is you're never going to pull through that bus bar in your emergency disconnect more than the breaker in your service panel.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So 200 amps is the max that's ever going to flow from directionally towards your house. Now, then the other issue is how much could flow directionally towards the grid. Well, that is only whatever's coming from the array.
Yeah.
Right? So as long as the array doesn't exceed 200 amps and the grid doesn't exceed 200 amps, then never will more than 200 amps flow over that bus bar in that emergency disconnect.
Yeah.
So that would be my assumption. But just as our discussion points out, try and explain that to an inspector, because you may be here for, because the inspector, it doesn't matter what the logic is. If the inspector says no, then that's just the way it's going to be. So, so this is my logic on it. And I guess I was hoping to get that kind of feedback of, is the logic sound? And because I could find nobody expressing any issue around the 120% rule on that. Yeah, okay. Taylor is just putting in the comments, we've done 60 to 80 amps in outside load centers like that, and no D-rate is required. So at least in West Virginia, where Taylor is, the inspector has let him get away. And I think it's not a matter of getting away with anything. I think it's just logical that there shouldn't be that problem. Okay, so that was one. Okay, before I get away from load side connections, does anybody else? Yeah, Taylor adds that it is logic, but logic never stopped an inspector from doing their job. So,
EJ, one other question. Sorry to put so many questions in.
oh, that's
you
good.
just talked about load side disconnects, or you just talked about emergency disconnects. Are you going to cover the rapid shutdown switch and UL 1479 also?
Not in this session. I could. Yeah, you're talking about like if you've got an AC coupled or a DC coupled system. Yeah.
It's just a related topic because both of them are about protecting the grid and first responders. So
yeah. Okay. Well, let me see if I can touch on that really quickly. I'll just get a picture in people's minds. So you've got your meter out here, and now you've got your utility emergency disconnect out there. Well, somewhere within 10 feet of this, you're supposed to have your AC disconnect, which in theory shuts off your array, right? Shuts off the array at the array. Okay, so I always thought that was a bit redundant, because if you pulled the meter or you disconnect from your utility, the inverters are supposed to recognize that the grid is down and shut off. But the AC disconnect is there, I guess, is an additional safety matter or whatever. So it's out there. Well, what happens if you've got battery backup or sunlight backup with Enphase? If you now have turned off the grid, well, it goes into standalone mode, which means the smart switch disconnects you from the grid, so you're not going to backfeed, and now you're generating power and the house is still live. All right, then you go ahead and you turn off that AC disconnect. You've disconnected the array. You know what? The batteries aren't going to recharge, but they're still going to operate. There's still going to be power in the house. So now the NEC says when that's the case, you've got to have a rapid shutdown disconnect as well that turns off the batteries, essentially. And it's got to be co-located out there near that meter within 10 feet. So at this point, you're going to have a utility disconnect, an array disconnect, which is your AC disconnect, and your rapid shutdown disconnect, which is your battery disconnect. All of those have to be co-located out there near that meter. The reason for that, of course, is if you get a first responder coming, your house is on fire, they want to go in, they want to deal with it. They want to make sure there's no power in the house. They don't want to cut through a wall or a roof to vent smoke and cut through live wires and end up getting killed. So it used to be you just pulled the meter, boom, but now there's different options. So 3 of them. And Taylor just mentioned you could have a placard. If you can't have them right next to each other, you can have a placard that tells the people where these disconnects are, although I will warn you that some inspectors will not accept that. They want it where they want it. But there are situations where that's just going to be the case. For example, we were dealing with a system at a school, and the meter was located right next to the front door as a high school. Do you really want to disconnect right next to the front door of a high school, where every high school boy is going to walk past there and turn off what they think is turning off the electricity? So, so there's if you can just put a little placard saying the disconnect is around the corner, protected with security cameras or whatever, who knows? Okay. So those are, Paul, was that what you were hoping for? Is that the depth of that?
No, it was perfect. You actually set it up swimmingly. I just thought it would be a topic that would be of interest to those who are quickly shutting things off.
Yeah, we do have another video we did not too long ago all about all the different disconnects in your system. So if you want to do a little bit deeper into that, run back and look at one of those videos about all the disconnects, because it's getting confusing. It's getting more and more confusing. And of course they had the 6 handle rule, in the NEC about there can't be more than 6 disconnects, but it's my understanding they've even kind of done away with that. And so, that it's confused me at this point. And it's kind of funny about 6 handle rule, because there's no magic to 6 handles. It turned out in the 1930s when they were arguing about this, somebody wanted 10, somebody wanted 2, and they just compromised on 6, so somebody arguing in the 1930s has led us to 6 handle rule. Who knows what we're arguing about today that'll stick around for the next 100 years. Okay. Okay. So hopefully that's load side connection. Supply side connection is basically, the load side connection is when you're connecting your array on the customer side of the main disconnect. That's a load side connection. And they're typically very preferable for us who are installing these systems, because you can just turn off the main and make your connection and you're not dealing with live wires. You know, you may have a live bus bar or something like that you've got to worry about. And in some jurisdictions, they do require that these final connections to the grid be made by a licensed electrician. But in some jurisdictions we've run into where the solar installer can go ahead and install the entire system, the electrician just has to come in and turn the breaker on because we're not competent to do that. But in many cases where you're actually going to have to disconnect the utility, then yes, very much. I want a licensed electrician, someone who knows what they're doing to deal with that. Now you're into the world of line side or supply side connections because it's between the main disconnect and the utility, your utility meter, I should say. If you put it on the utility side of the meter, in theory, you could do that, but of course now you're paying for your own electricity. You know, everything you're generating is coming back through the meter, so you're going to pay for it. Anything you send out doesn't get accounted for. So, so anyway, that's so we get into a supply side connection issue. It can be almost anywhere between the main and the meter. A couple of little things, I don't want to get too deep into it, but there are some amperage limitations if you are doing by a minimum 60 amp wire is required there. So that's just an aside. Some of the ways people do this is with a tap, for example. I personally am not all that keen on taps. They just feel dodgy to me. But a lot of people use them and a lot of people swear by them. The ones on the bottom there are tapping in within the service panel box right above the main. That feels really dodgy, but that's what they do. And then this is just another example of a junction box of sorts where you can use the bus bars. Something like this would be required. You'd have to cut that wire between the service panel and the meter, and then put in a junction box and make your connection in there. So what size wire are you going to use to connect, say, your inverter? You know, it would come from an AC disconnect, but it would come in there to meet up with that wire. Well, that can be a bit confusing because you might think I'm connecting this into a 200 amp service. So I better have wire big enough to handle 200 amps. And if you thought that, you'd probably be wrong. So what do we do? What do we use for guidance on that? Because remember, we're feeding the energy in. We're not creating a load. So basically what they're saying, the 10-foot tap rule says that if you feed into that tap and it's less than 10 feet from the inverter from the AC disconnect, to the tap, then you can use the 10-foot tap rule. And that is basically saying, all right, 10% times the feeder breaker rating plus the inverter output rating times 1.25. So for example, in this example, we said, let's say you have 200 amp service, that's your breaker rating, and the output current from the inverter is 15 amps. Well, then you would take, and that's the maximum output, by the way. You do 200 amps plus 15 amps times 1.25, you're getting 218.75 amps. Multiply that times 10%, and you could get by with wire that's rated to 21.875 amps in theory. But remember what I said, it's got to be minimum rated 60 amps. So the 10-foot tap rule would say 22 amps, but 60 amps is your minimum. If it's more than 10 foot, then you're into the 25, and it's the same way of doing it, except it's 33% rather than 10%. And in this case, we're going to get a 73 amp rated wire. So in the one case, we would go with the 60 amp rated wire because that's the minimum, even though we could in theory get 20 something. And then there's 73 amps. So we would have to go up to that if it's a longer tap. Once again, this is probably deeper into the weeds than you wanted to go, but just to give you a sense of some of the things that are there. Well, we've got about 5 minutes. Anybody have any comments on these final connections? Hopefully I enlightened rather than confused people. So give anybody a final go before we call it a day. Oh, nicely done. That's always nice. Pat on the back. I'll tell myself I did well. So, all right. Well, hearing no comments, we'll call this a day and we'll get back. Tell your family you did well. We'll get back to this in 2 weeks. All right. Thank you guys very much. Take care. Bye-bye.